Dark Souls 2 is kind of like the Dark Souls of Dark Souls games, by which I mean it's obscure, it has frustrating mechanics, and it feels difficult for difficulty's sake. This is a little ironic because in an interview with Miyazaki, he talks about himself being a kind of masochist, so the kinds of deaths that he had implemented in Dark Souls 1 were the kind of deaths that he felt he'd enjoy as a player, and coming into Dark Souls 2 it definitely doesn't have that same kind of enjoyment in deaths that I think Dark Souls 1 had. It's a little bit hard to explain, but Dark Souls 1's deaths generally felt fair or the product of the player's own mistakes, whereas in Dark Souls 2, it feels as though the developers were really trying to go the extra mile to screw over the player and punish them for ignorance of certain areas or encounters and things like that. So one example of this would be in the Forest of Fallen Giants, there's tons of placements where enemies will attack players from their blind spots. So you pretty much have to have foreknowledge of what to expect to avoid a lot of the random stuff that they throw at you. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, if you kind of hung back and were observant, you could more or less navigate through the different areas without too much difficulty. So Dark Souls 2 feels as though they really try to mess with the player and attack them from their blind spot and hit them in their ignorance rather than creating more engaging gameplay to me. Dark Souls 2 does a pretty poor job of tutorializing the game in general. So one example of this would be how there's an NPC in the Forest of Fallen Giants that throws Molotov cocktails, and if he manages to throw them at some certain barrels, it'll cause a wall to explode and reveal a shortcut to the nearby bonfire, which is perfectly fine. However, there's nothing really setting that up as a kind of core mechanic to the game, and it appears again in like the Lost Bastille, which unlocks McDuff, so if you want to infuse your weapons, you have to have another random NPC roll an exploding barrel at a certain trajectory to actually hit this wall to unlock McDuff, which is kind of a big deal since how else are you going to really infuse your weapons? But yeah, it just does not set that up very well, and games like Legend of Zelda at least have like more cracks in the walls or more lead-ups into those kind of hidden secrets, whereas with Dark Souls 2, it seems to either rely on the player using soapstones to guide them through the game, or just kind of dumb luck in unlocking some of these features, which is really unfortunate in my opinion. Another way that things aren't tutorialized very well would be how the player can attack carts and things to break them down. At the very beginning of Things Betwixt, they do show off that mechanic, which is fine, although I think it is counterintuitive to try to break down doors, which appears once again in Forest of the Fallen Giants, and even in the other part of Lost Bastille, that certain doors can be blocked from the other side, and by trying to attack them, that can open access to the doors. It's interesting, but I don't think it's led up to very well. Maybe if they had like more enemies breaking through doors to kind of make that more obvious, it would have done better for the game, but they just do a very poor job either introducing these aspects of the game or foreshadowing them through level design. And one of the frustrating things about that is Dark Souls 1, even though it does have its own issues, which are similar to Dark Souls 2, at least they do try to tutorialize some of that stuff. So in the Catacombs, there is a small section of a wall that's partially broken, and beneath the wall there is kind of the orange soapstone sign indicating that the wall can be broken through if you even want to read that sign. So at least they do set that up somewhat better. Although there are still areas in Dark Souls 1 where it's not quite so obvious, like trying to go to Ash Lake, for instance. Going back to Legend of Zelda, while it does have some missable things, it does a better job at rewarding the player for exploring and setting up what to expect throughout the game world. Whereas Dark Souls 2 doesn't do that in comparison, and at times it almost feels punishing to explore a bit too thoroughly. So one example of that would be the Pharos Lockstones and Fragrant Branches of Yore. There are certain times where you can use these and more or less just get trolled and not be rewarded with anything for using one of these very rare supplies. And it feels really bad in comparison to games like Legend of Zelda, where exploring pretty much only gives you positive outcomes. So I know for some people that could be part of the charm of Dark Souls 2, that not everything is going to work out the way that you'd like. I understand that. But just from a gameplay perspective, it feels really bad because you can't always go get more Pharos Lockstones or Fragrant Branches of Yore without putting in much more work than is necessary for fairly negligible rewards for the most part. So that really ties into the overall item economy of Dark Souls 2. There are certain items that are locked behind Pharos Lockstones and Fragrant Branches of Yore, but you already need to know which ones to go through, and that just really pushes people into looking at secondary sources of information like guides, which I think is a really big design flaw, and it's something shared in common with pretty much all the FromSoft games at this point. With that in mind, there are some good things about the item economy. So for instance, Dark Souls 2 returns to having kind of more of a hub world, so it's really easy to go back and get items so you're not as screwed for making misplays or having to traverse between different aspects of the game just to get a few more supplies. So that's a really good thing for Dark Souls 2. But conversely, some things which are really cool don't end up working out as well as they could have. So I really like the inclusion of torches as a thematic element of the game, but I feel like the execution could have used some work. So I really enjoyed having the sconces allow players to gain certain items or rewards for completely exploring an area and lighting all of them, but it's really only relevant for certain sections of the game. If it was fleshed out a bit more, I'd enjoy it more. And one of the issues with the torches and the sconces in general is that the supplies are limited, which is it's fine, but it just doesn't really work out as well as it could. What I mean by that is in the early section of the game, not many newer players are going to have torches to light the sconces, and that's not that big a deal. But at the end of the game, you're essentially just going to be swimming in sconces and flame butterflies, so you can light your torches at any second. And so it just really kind of punishes noobs rather than veterans, and it just could have been better overall. But good idea, just poor implementation, I think. Aside from that, we could address the elephant in the room in terms of like the item economy, and that in Dark Souls 2, if you die, you will begin to go hollow, and as a byproduct of that, you will begin to lose some of your max HP for each death up until a certain point. And the way to undo that is by having human effigies. Generally, the human effigies are pretty plentiful in the game, so I don't think it's that big an issue, but it would probably be better if there was like an infinite supply of them from merchants. It's a little bit annoying that merchants will have limited items when that's essentially just tied to your max HP. So Dark Souls 2, more so than the other games, does more of a job in punishing newer players or low-skilled players than the other ones. Maybe Demon Souls is closer to Dark Souls 2 in that regard, but after Dark Souls 1, they could have really done better on that front. So one of the positives of Dark Souls 2, even though it does have a Covenant grind and those always suck, is that if you're able to go into New Game Plus 2, Chancellor Williger in Drangleic will sell all of the Covenant items in his shop, which I think is an excellent addition to the game. And in general, trying to farm for enemy drops is okay, but one of the things that makes it really annoying or jarring in Dark Souls 2 is the inclusion of the extinction mechanic. So I've got a little bit of mixed feelings about that, because obviously it'll help players who aren't very skilled at the game proceed through without too much more difficulty, but on the other hand, it's not explained at all, and it's a little bit confusing. Like the first time an enemy didn't show up for me on my very first playthrough, I thought like my game was bugged, and it was very jarring after coming from Dark Souls 1. So this might be more of like an issue with me already having previous experience and having some expectations that didn't align with how the game functioned, but it's unfortunate that the only way to bring some of these enemies back is by joining the Covenant of Champions and increasing their difficulty as a result, especially if you want to farm for some items. And having to farm for some items and giving them terrible drop rates just kind of feels really bad in a single player game that's like not an MMO or subscription based or anything like that. And one of the very good things about Dark Souls 2 is the inclusion of the Bonfire Aesthetics, so you can essentially reset a portion of the map back to its default state but increase the overall difficulty of the area, and that'll give you more opportunities to farm enemies, including bosses, to get their boss souls. So you don't necessarily have to go and fight, you don't have to go through New Game Plus or whatever to get like the third instance of a boss soul to like transpose it for an item, which is an excellent addition to the game that I really enjoyed. And aside from like the Bonfire Aesthetics, there's also the inclusion of new enemy placements, which I think was also an excellent addition to kind of vary things up. However, a lot of it just kind of ends up feeling more like enemy spam, unfortunately. So while certain enemies are added, it's not like the overall placement of the enemies differ or the areas differ more than that. There are a few exceptions with being able to fight like the Duxter Phrasia early, which I really enjoy, but it's just enemy spam mostly. So going from enemy spam, let's go ahead and segue into combat. Now, I couldn't stand the melee combat of Dark Souls 2, so I actually had to switch to a ranged caster for the first time, which is unfortunate because I know a lot of people like power stancing, but I never really experienced it for myself because I couldn't enjoy the combat that much. And generally, my strategy was to interact with the game as little as possible, so that's kind of a weird way to interact with the game, I guess, although it's a perfectly valid one. It's good that they have it in the game, but I didn't enjoy Dark Souls 2's combat as much as even Demon Souls, really. Switching from melee to a caster was a completely different experience. Like, a lot of the parts of the game which really frustrated me as a melee character became much more trivialized as a caster. So areas like Brightstone Cove, Seldora, with all the spiders that drop down, that was trivialized just by being able to snipe them from a distance. Same thing with Shrine of Amano, which I know is kind of like hell for a lot of melee builds. The one exception of casters having dominion over the entire game may be in like Shaded Woods, where you can't really lock onto the enemies. While I do find that area to be annoying, I honestly didn't mind it as much as Forest of the Fallen Giants, partially because Shaded Woods feels more thematic with the way that it throws its enemies at you. You kind of knew what you were going up against, whereas in places like Forest of the Fallen Giants and a little bit of the Lost Bastille, the developers tried to attack players from their blind spots or spots that they literally couldn't see. For that reason, I do like Shaded Woods a little bit more than Forest of the Fallen Giants, and that's why I would say Forest of the Fallen Giants is probably my least favorite tutorial area of the franchise. Speaking of locking on, it's pretty bad in Dark Souls 2 in general, especially if some enemies are like going between different elevations. So for the most part, I relied on my binoculars, and that's only because I knew you can use your binoculars and still cast spells with your other hand, and I don't really think many newer people are going to know about that. It almost feels a bit cheesy to do it, so another example of kind of poor tutorialization that way. But again, if you like the experience of trying to figure things out for yourself, it's a pretty interesting mechanic. It's a little bit unfortunate that it's not more widely known, I think. Overall, I do give a big plus to Dark Souls 2's binoculars. They zoom in really quickly and you can actually move around with them, which is really nice, especially when you're trying to get footage for lore playthroughs. But one other way that I think the game favors casters versus melee fighters would be that your attunement stat also levels up your agility, which affects quite a few things. The agility stat governs how many invincibility frames you get per roll. It also increases how quickly you can drink your Estus flasks and use your consumables. This makes it feel better to level up as a caster in general, because leveling up your attunement gives you more spell slots, so you feel as though you're getting more return on your investment, whereas you don't really get those kind of tangible results as a melee character. It really just takes outside knowledge to even know that you're buffing your rolls by increasing your adaptability and therefore your agility, and it's so convoluted that the way that the system works that it really just shouldn't have been in the game at all. One other really painful part of combat for me was the speed of Estus recovery. Now, I don't necessarily mean the animation of chugging, but literally how long it takes for your health to recover from using your Estus. I have another video on my channel where I compared the Estus healing speeds between all three games, and it's literally over 3 times as long to recover your HP in Dark Souls 2 than in Dark Souls 1 and 3. So typically if you drank in Dark Souls 1 or 3 and took a hit, you'd be able to survive because your health had already increased by that point. But in Dark Souls 2, it's not really that way at all. So if you're in the midst of drinking and then you get hit almost immediately, you're going to die. So that was a real painful part of trying to come to terms with Dark Souls 2's combat. And admittedly, that's really more of a me problem than the game's fault. If I hadn't played the other Dark Souls games beforehand, would I have really noticed this? I don't really know. So I do think it's a little bit unfair for me to hold the game to that kind of standard. However, it is a little bit jarring if you are used to the other games going into Dark Souls 2. One of the positives that I really enjoyed about Dark Souls 2, especially when I was doing like my lore playthrough to gather footage, would be that your character model will slouch naturally when they're on low HP. So if you are playing HUDless, you can see when your character needs to heal, and I thought that was really nice, and a bit of a shame that it wasn't in the other games, to be honest. Arguably, Dark Souls 2's best feature is its non-linearity, and I think it's really cool being able to choose which order you want to kill the 4 reincarnations of Dark Souls 1's bosses. I also think it's brilliant being able to access the Shrine of Winter by having 1 million souls, as it gives the players more agency in how they want to choose to access the game. Beyond that, I think the game is a bit too vague in telling the player what to do, and one example of this would be trying to figure out where to go after you meet the Ancient Dragon and get the Ashen Mist Heart. This isn't necessarily limited to language, because it's super vague in Japanese as well, but it's very unclear who the Withered are or what you need to do to progress the game beyond that point. This wouldn't be as big a deal if there weren't certain consequences for deciding what order to go through the Giant's memories, but my first time playing through the game, I had missed Benhart of Jugo's quest because I'd killed the Giant Lord first, and I actually had to go back and back up my save file to be able to get his sword and equipment. Now, this is only because I also had the foresight to make multiple saves as I was going along because I was playing on PC, but it really suffers that the game forces players to autosave rather than giving them a more robust save system, because it's a real pain being able to screw up your save file or have to start a new Game Plus cycle just to undo a trivial mistake that you really had no knowledge of making beforehand. So not being able to save in multiple slots really hurts the game, I think, especially when you're trying to complete a lot of the NPC quests, because if you have to summon many of these NPCs for boss fights, you also need to keep them alive for the duration of that boss fight, which is a little bit easier said than done because their AI is so bad. So you really need to work on burning down the boss as quickly as possible, but it's just such an unnecessary pain if you can't go back to reload your spot without using external sources to do so. And on that note, I do like that the NPCs are more interactive overall. I think it's a cool idea of having more NPCs summoned for boss fights. However, it is a little bit of a double-edged sword if you want to play through the game solo to have that experience of fighting the bosses and beating them on your own. So, a little bit of a double-edged sword there, both good and bad depending how you look at it. This brings us to the lore of the game, and there's quite a lot to say about it. So, generally I think Dark Souls 2 has some of the best lore in the entire series in terms of focusing on the specifics of the world's mechanics, but I think its macro lore really suffers in comparison. So, stuff pertaining to darkness and curses are really fleshed out very well in Dark Souls 2 and help us get a better understanding of Dark Souls 1 and 3. And one of the things that I really enjoy was like Lucatiel's questline, and I think it does an amazing job of showing like the human element of the NPCs in the world, of what it really means to be stuck in Lordran or Drangleic, being forced to be undead and lose your mind and go hollow. I think that's some really powerful stuff that I really enjoyed in Dark Souls 2, much more than the other games. However, some of the worst things about Dark Souls 2's lore was having the 4 big bads of Dark Souls 1 return. It feels really out of place within the context of Dark Souls 2 alone. For example, the Lost Sinner doesn't feel like Izalith at all. Like, if you took the bug out of the little cutscene that she has, would you really get any indication that she's related to Izalith whatsoever? I mean, there's arguments that New Game Plus she's got like the 2 pyromancers that joined the fight, but I think that's really weak overall. And I think the Burnt Ivory King felt more like Izalith than the Lost Sinner did. And then kind of the same thing goes for Gwyn. He doesn't really feel like the Old Iron King or Icarus Earth as he became later known as. And I would say Vendrick feels more like the Gwyn figure of Dark Souls 2 than the Old Iron King does. And one of the other questions that I have is, why is Gwyn's name ineffable? It would have been nice if there was a little bit more expanded on that as to why they shouldn't be named. We just kind of have to go with what we have, which is not very much at all. And then, going to the Rotten, he is obviously another black hole in the lore. I think he'd be okay if there were more connections to the Rotten, to the Milfinito and Agdane. since the one who gave them the first death created them, like why don't they serve the rotten? Why isn't there more connection between themselves and the rotten? They kind of seem more affiliated with Vendrick in some ways, but you know, Vendrick could have conquered them, so I'll just kind of leave that alone for now. Duke's Theophrasia is actually okay with me. I like the idea of the spiders gaining Seath's soul or his power through what may have been his corpse, but it does beg the question of what happened to the Four Kings if Seath was reincarnated. You'd expect them to be in the game, but we don't really have anything like that. Generally, I think they should have done more to make the 4 bosses of Dark Souls 1 feel more relevant in Dark Souls 2. Right now, it just feels more like fan service and that they don't even fit within the internal logic of Dark Souls 2, especially with like the Rotten and the Milfinito. Aside from that, they did add more stuff into Dark Souls 2 to make it stand off from Dark Souls 1, which is good, but I feel like they should have gone maybe a little bit farther to make them more distinct. Some example of this would be the Children of the Dark. They definitely don't feel related to Manus whatsoever, but you know, they're doing their own thing, and that's perfectly fine. But one other aspect of Dark Souls 2 which does not fit very well with Dark Souls 1 to me would be the inclusion of the thrones and the monarchs. It's an interesting idea, I understand what they're going for with it, but it just doesn't really feel that compelling to me, because the concept of choosing your own fate isn't as strongly presented in Dark Souls 2 as I think it could be. So for example, we know we're sent to Drangleic to kind of overcome the curse of the undead, but other than that, like, we really don't have much ties into the curse of the undead and our actions in Drangleic. Like, killing the lords, gaining their souls, becoming strong enough to face Vendrick and Ashandra, that's all well and good, and it allows us to link the flame. That really doesn't answer the question of, does that solve hollowing? I know there's the whole thing with the DLCs and gaining the crown to do so, but it just feels really hollow, no pun intended, with the way that I think it's ultimately implemented. There are also some issues of translation which makes things a bit more obscure. Like for instance, one of the lines that really bothered me in English was when Shamalot says, "You'll go to the throne without really knowing why." That was just extremely frustrating. Like, it almost felt like it was cheapening the lore of the game. Like, you're just doing this stuff, it doesn't really matter why you're doing it. But it turns out in Japanese she says, you'll end up going to like the Throne of Want whether you wish to or not. So that's kind of interesting to me, because even though it kind of limits the player's agency in a certain sense, like, oh, you're gonna end up there no matter what you do, it is a bit more thematic. Like, the more power you have, the more power it attracts in a certain way. So I do like that kind of thematic element that was present in the Japanese. And there's also quite a lot of implications that get glossed over between Aldia and Vendrick's English dialogue compared to the Japanese. That's kind of a lot to talk about, so I'll just kind of leave that vague for now. But other than that, I do think Vendrick and Aldia were really cool as characters. I do think it's a bit frustrating how vague Vendrick's interaction with the crowns were, especially in terms of like needing humanity to access his Shrine of Amana throne room. That's really not spelled out at all. You really have to explore that area again after coming through the DLC to get his crown and his armor, and it's just very non-intuitive. And aside from that, I do like the inclusion of a lot of disparate elements of the lore. I like the Rat King. I wish he would have had a return in Dark Souls 3, but we'll just take what we have for now. I liked the DLCs quite a bit, although each of them had an area that just felt god-awful to play through. So Shulva's Gank Squad, just terrible. The Broom Tower Salamander Passage, awful. Frozen Outskirts, does anything really need to be said about that? One of the other things that I liked were the kind of miscellaneous secrets. For example, if you no-hit Alan, he'll have a different death animation where he commits seppuku. That's something that's really cool. I like those kind of Easter eggs. Also, if you wear the certain set which enrages the Fume Knight, as soon as you walk into the door, I think that's a really cool feature. I think it's Velstadt. I should have looked at that before talking about this. As I mentioned earlier, I do like soul memory allowing for sequence breaking. Being able to just use Bonfire Aesthetics to get 1,000,000 souls to kill the Rotten really quickly to go through the Shrine of Winter is a very interesting way to like speedrun the game. I do like in Dark Souls 2 they finally introduced what I would call like NPC Kill Quotes. So if you get killed by certain NPCs, they'll kind of talk down to the player. Maybe Chester said something as well, I don't fully remember, but it is more robust in Dark Souls 2 by far. Another feature that I like was having to like get the 4 knights to help you kill the Burnt Ivory King. Although I think the actual implementation of the fight was very frustrating, especially like farming for the souls for Alsana. It would have been fine if it was like a one and done thing, but having to grind so much really just kind of ruined the fight overall. Another thing I really enjoyed about Dark Souls 2 is how hilarious the NPC Phantoms were. NPCs like Muldrin the Assassin, where he just runs away from the player to get a terrain advantage, was really nice, as well as him using like Chameleon to get the jump on the player. It really felt like it was trying to bring more of the online component to those playing offline, so I really appreciated them taking the effort to do that. Another thing I enjoyed is the jump of Dark Souls 2. It's much further than all of the other games, and it was just kind of nice to have, honestly. And then one of the other cool things was the ability to fight Pursuer early, as well as Dux de Euphrasia in New Game Plus. So those are the kinds of things that I really enjoyed about the game that just don't really fit into everywhere else. And so some of the things that I did not enjoy, a lot of the bosses are pretty lackluster. The camera lock-on was really bad, so having to fight enemies like the Royal Rat Vanguard was just really a poor experience my first time through the game. I had gone through Hades Tower of Flame, beat those bosses, and then I decided to go down into the well, and then I fought the Vanguard, and it was just not a good experience because I was a little bit underleveled, and there were so many moving parts of the fight that it just was not fun, and it was not very interactive, to say the least. One of the other really big negatives is mechanics not being explained very well. One of the most obvious examples of that would be how Mytha regains her HP and poison, and if you like burn the windmill, that'll like get rid of the poison, but it's not very clear what you need to do to get rid of that poison to begin with. I know there's an NPC that you can summon that is supposed to point you towards that direction, but if you're playing offline and you don't have like the summon stone guidance to give you an indication of what to do, it's really easy to kind of crash on her. She might be one of the harder bosses if she's able to heal in the poison. Another thing is there is those differences between Scholar of the First Sin versus Vanilla. I don't really know exactly what all of the differences were. I know there's like a lot of differences with enemy placement. Some NPC placements, like Vengarl's body, is a bit different, which is fine. But it does call into question what should also be considered canon, because a few item descriptions were changed. So should we completely throw out what was in Vanilla, or is it also still somewhat valid? I think those are some interesting questions we can ask, but it is unfortunate that they pretty much did have to revise the game, and I think they also had to revise it for a reason, so take that for what you will. And this is really minor, but I really hated it, was how at the very beginning of the game the Firekeepers laugh at you and say you'll die over and over. It just felt really on the nose. I don't know, it just really took me out of being immersed into this kind of new fantasy world. Another extremely bad thing about Dark Souls 2 is the boss runs. The DLCs really ramp it up to 11 with the frozen outskirts running into Lud and Zolin. And the same thing with Alan. It's an annoying run up, but it's not like the worst thing. Overall, I think the game really suffers for just being titled Dark Souls to begin with. And this is kind of like the core issue of the game for me. If it wasn't called Dark Souls, would I have continued playing it? How many players would have continued playing it? I don't really know. I think by it having the Dark Souls title, it does create some unfair expectations of what to expect, like with the Estus flask speed, for instance. But also, I think if the game wasn't called Dark Souls, I don't think I would have continued playing it. So overall, this is going to be a bit of a rough score, but if I were to give the game a ranking on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being a terrible game, riddled with flaws, 5 being an average yet enjoyable game, and 10 being an absolutely flawless game with nothing that I'd want to change, I would give Dark Souls 2 a 3 out of 10. The main reason I'd give it a 3 out of 10 is simply because the game just wasn't fun or enjoyable for me. Every time that I quit Dark Souls 2, it wasn't necessarily out of frustration, but it's just because I didn't really feel like turning it on and having to play it again, which is kind of an awful experience, to be honest. I have taken breaks from Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne at times that I was frustrated, but whenever I did do that, I always wanted to go back and beat what was frustrating me and actually complete the game for my own. But I didn't really have that feeling playing through Dark Souls 2. And honestly, the only reason why I did go back and complete the game is because it was titled Dark Souls 2. But this also brings up some fundamental questions that I'd give you, the audience. Would you have completed Dark Souls 2 or even bothered to play Dark Souls 2 if it didn't have the title Dark Souls in it? The only reason why I completed the game was because it was a Dark Souls title, and I wanted to talk about the lore of the series, and I definitely needed footage to do that. So, if it wasn't for that, I don't think that I would have continued playing through the game, which I think really speaks volumes as to its quality. But in some ways, I'd almost recommend others try Dark Souls 2 first out of the games, but on the other hand, I also wouldn't want to turn them off from the series prematurely because it does play the most poorly. So it does become a bit difficult for me to try to recommend Dark Souls 2 to others just because I personally did not enjoy the game very much at all. Like, the only people that I'd really bother recommending it to would be people who really want to experience everything in the Dark Souls catalog, but my caveat would be use a ranged caster build because it'll make the game much more manageable, and that also helps if you know about the binoculars beforehand. Otherwise, I really can't recommend it in good faith to others. I honestly don't like to be this negative about the games, but I am trying to give my most honest feedback that I can, and hopefully you guys think I've been fair about this as well, and I am also curious as to what you guys would give Dark Souls 2, because I feel as though I might be a little bit too critical of the games. So that pretty much summarizes my review of Dark Souls 2. I hope you enjoyed it, or even if you didn't enjoy it, I hope it gave you more food for thoughts. As always, I'd like to close out by thanking all of my patrons, viewers, channel subscribers, commenters. I really appreciate all of that. And if you want to talk more lore or Dark Souls games or games and things like that in general, we do have a Discord server where we've got a lot of people interested in various topics. So that'll be linked in the channel description, and feel free to join. As always, consider liking, subscribing, commenting, all that stuff with the algorithm. Go ahead and dislike if you want, because it doesn't mean anything anymore. And hopefully we'll catch you out on the next one. LastProtagonist out.